Hi everyone, and welcome to today's presentation on Australian LGBTQIA Buddhists. My name is Dr. Stephen Kerry and I'm here at Charlesdale University. What I'm doing today is presenting my research on queer Buddhists, and this is the first part of this research, and I'm hoping to go through some of the early findings of what we have come up with so far. I'd like to firstly acknowledge that this research was conducted on the traditional lands of the Larrakia people here in Darwin, and I pay my respects to elders both past, present and emerging. I want to start really at the end. So what generally we do in these presentations is go through a whole heap of key points and then do a summary at the end. But I'm going to start with my summary. So if you take nothing away from my research presentation today, there are 4 things I want you to remember. What we found was that more than half of the participants were reluctant to reveal their queer identities to their Buddhist communities. More than half had witnessed some form of sexism within their Buddhist communities. 1/3 had witnessed some form of homophobia within their Buddhist communities, and 16% had been told that their queer identity is not in keeping with the Buddha's teachings. Now I'm going to spend some time going through some of the detail of the research itself. But before we do that, let's have a look at Buddhism. So research has suggested that this prevailing image of Buddhism practice is the solitary meditator with eyes half closed who is sitting in the lotus position. It's been suggested that this image doesn't necessarily reflect the accuracy of Buddhist life, either across the world or here in Australia. Halof and colleagues state that there is little known about Buddhism in mainstream Australian culture. And certainly I've experienced this myself. When we talk to people about what Buddhism is, most people in the West have very limited or inaccurate view of what Buddhism really is. So let's have a little quick of a history. So bear with me if this is familiar to you. So Buddhism started with the Buddha, an historical person known as Siddhartha Gautama, and he was named the Buddha. Buddha really means enlightened one, so many people can be called the Buddha, but historically we refer to this as Siddhartha Gautama. He was born in Lumbini in what is now modern-day Nepal, and there's not really consensus on when he was born, but it was roughly 400, 500 BCE. For those who are not familiar with BCE, this is before the Common Era and replaces BC or Anno Domini. The Buddha came up with what we refer to as 4 noble truths, 4 main ideas of living life and achieving enlightenment, if you like. So we refer to these as the 4 noble truths. And the first one is that life is dukkha, which is often translated into English as suffering. But for most people who know multiple languages, you know that sometimes translating into English is sometimes problematic because it doesn't always capture the nuance of the original. So when we mean suffering, we don't really mean it in the same way we may see it in English. So dukkha, suffering. He argued that the origin of dukkha is wanting life to be different. So what he's really saying here is that no matter how much we live in our lives, we're always wanting the present moment to be different to what it is. So for example, if we're sad, we're wanting to be happy. But if we get happy, we're still wanting to stay happy. Whatever is making us happy, we want to keep that. So the wanting is always present. The third noble truth is that there is an end to dukkha. That is that this wanting causes us suffering and there is an ending to that. And the ending is known as the path, or the Eightfold Path, which I won't go into today, but these are the 4 noble truths, and this is really one of the few things that all Buddhists would generally agree with. So this is a breakdown, everyone likes little statistics of where Buddhism is practiced in the world. You'll see predominantly in Southeast Asia, also East Asia, and also some so-called Western countries as well, like Australia. Okay, so let's go back to my research. And a little bit about the methodology of what I've used. So beginning of this year, I put together an advisory group. I invited a couple of people to help me put together this research and come up with research questions and advise me on how to progress with the research. So I want to thank them much for their assistance this year. I did an online survey. I'm using SurveyMonkey, and this was open between April and October of this year. There were 5 broad themes of the questions that we used: demographic information, questions about Buddhist identity, Buddhist practice, health, and the interrelationship between Buddhism and being a queer person. Recruitment involved informal networks, people known to myself and the advisory group, and also emailing 453 Australian Buddhist groups. And we did get some responses. People saying, "Yep, we're going to send it out," and other people saying, "Yep, we're not interested." There was a bit of a hit and miss with that process. Brain Bodhi, based in Sydney, is a queer Buddhist group, and they're great in assisting getting the word out about the research as well. And a shout out to Brain Bodhi because they're celebrating their first year anniversary this week. So a little bit about myself and why I'm doing this research. So I'm Dr. Stephen Kerry, and I'm a lecturer here at Charles Darwin University in sociology. I identify as genderqueer, non-binary, and I use the pronouns they, them, and their. So I've been part of the queer community for 30 years, and I've always used my lived experiences as a guiding force for my research. And I've done a lot of research on gender, sexuality, particularly the last few years looking at transgender here in the Northern Territory, and also previously looking at intersex and intersex identity and lived experiences. I'm also a Zen Buddhist, and in 2019 I underwent my Jukai ceremony. I'm just going to pause while I put on my rakusu, and I was assigned the Dharma name called Monkey. So as you can see, I revealed this sort of information about myself because I feel as though this is the guiding force for a lot of my research. And I use my lived experiences as a way of understanding the world around us. So it's coming from a passion, a personal passion. And I use my skills as a researcher to help understand parts of the community that I'm interested in, and also that we really don't know much about. So let's go back to the responses. So we had 111 people who came to the website to do the survey. 20 were originally disqualified because they weren't Australian citizens or permanent residents, and 9 navigated away from the survey after completing a few questions. So not really enough to really include in the analysis itself. So we're left with 82 participants, and for an online survey in a relatively short period of time, this is a really good result. I designated the participants with P1 to P82, and as we go through this presentation, you'll see I'll refer to them in this way, and I also put their sexuality and gender in parentheses as a way of giving some information about who they are. A little bit about language. So we use the phrase LGBTQIA+, which for those who are not familiar with queer language and this terminology, this refers to lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, and asexual. This is not universal, that you will find some variation on this theme, but generally this is the most recent, and sometimes there'll be additions or subtractions from what we affectionately refer to as the alphabet. I generally won't use this acronym today because I'm dyslexic, and so sometimes saying the full letters gets confusing for me. So I'll use the word queer, but no insult is meant. Also, I've used the word Buddhist here, but not everybody who participated in this research does identify as a Buddhist. So I'm using it quite loosely to refer to people who both identify as Buddhist and who practice Buddhism. So please forgive me for not necessarily just limiting this to people who identify as Buddhists, but also people who engage in Buddhist practice as well. So a little bit of poetic license, if you will. Okay, so who were these queer Buddhists that participated? So I'm going to start with some of the little images to give you an indication of some of the detail. And we're going to go through some of these just to look at what is the demographics of the sort of configuration or the cohort of people that participated. So we had roughly the same amount of numbers for men and women, and there were a few people who used multiple identities, and there were a few people who used other terms such as trans, non-binary, genderqueer, for example. Similarly with sexuality, there were most people who identified as gay, lesbian or bisexual. Other terms such as straight, pansexual, polyamorous were also used. Equal numbers of people were in relationships as were single. And the people who were in relationships indicated that they were either in a relationship with one person, in a factor relationship, or they were married. A third of participants were currently living with a partner. A few were living alone and living with pets. And as somebody who lives alone with pets, I find that a really heartening statistic that I'm not alone in living alone with pets. There was a few skewed statistics in our research, one of which was age. So there were a significant skew towards people who are aged over 35. So there were only 13 people who were under 35. Almost half were aged between 35 and 55. And there were 30 people who were aged 55 or over. So this is quite significant in terms of understanding the demographic that we're talking about today. There was also a skew in terms of ethnicity. Most participants were of Caucasian or European descent. And more than half were born in Australia. Most participants spoke English at home. 14 spoke an Asian language, such as Mandarin. 6 spoke a European language like French. And 1 person spoke Afrikaans. Another skewed statistic was the number of people who were living in New South Wales. So more than half, about half of the participants lived in New South Wales, and fewer lived in the other states and territories. Not surprisingly, 3/4 of participants lived in a capital city. So this would be expected as well. 10 lived in a remote area. This is an area with less than 10,000. There were 8 people who lived in a non-capital city. So this is a city with more than 100,000. And there were 7 who lived in a regional town. This is between 10 and 100,000 people. Another significant skewing was that most participants possessed a university education. And of those, more than half had a postgraduate qualification, such as a graduate certificate, a master's degree, or a PhD. There were slightly more participants who were employed than out of the workforce. Most people who were employed full-time, or sorry, half of them were full-time. And of those out of the workforce, being retired was the most common. I asked participants to self-rate their physical and their mental health, and over half rate their physical and mental health as either good or very good. We also invited participants to participate in what's called the Kessler Psychological Distress Scale Test. And this is a standard wellness test that you may do if you go to see counselling or go to your GP. And 3/4 of participants were considered to be likely to be well. In 2017, Australia passed the marriage equality laws, and this was after a lengthy debate regarding whether or not these laws should be passed. And as a result, research has suggested that this debate had a negative impact upon queer Australians. I included a question regarding not just the marriage equality debates, but also the current religious freedoms debates. And participants indicated that both these debates, the marriage equality debate and the current debates about religious freedoms, have had a negative impact upon their mental health. Now I'm going to talk about the identities that the queer Buddhists exhibit. So first I asked participants to recall what answer did they give to the 2016 census question, the religious question in the census. Most participants stated that that their religion was Buddhism, and 15 indicated that there was no religion. I also asked participants to reflect on whether they would answer the same question the same way, and most participants said that they would answer the question the same way. Those who would change their question, half of whom would change it to Buddhism today. Also, half the participants self-described themselves as being religious. I also asked participants about the particular brand, if you like, particular school of Buddhism they followed. And half participants follow the Theravada tradition. You'll probably note here that these figures don't add up to 100%. This is because many participants actually indicated they follow multiple schools of Buddhism. I also asked participants about what religion they were raised, and 55% said that they were raised in a Christian religion. Next, we talk about what sort of practices do Buddhists do. And most currently attend or engage with a Buddhist group, centre, or temple. Those who don't attend a Buddhist group say this is because there is nothing nearby that they can access, they don't think they will be welcome, or they don't need to practice something in public, that it's a very private affair for them. Those who said that they had an at-home practice, 94% said that they do sitting meditation. Other activities they do at home is reading books, listening to talks or videos. And reading books, just said that. 3/4 of participants said that they attended a Buddhist retreat. A Buddhist retreat is an opportunity for people who practice Buddhism to spend either 5 days, 7 days, a month, even longer, in silent meditation. Those who say that they haven't attended a Buddhist retreat said this is because of either lack of interest or financial or family reasons. Okay, so let's have a look at the relationship between Buddhism and being a queer person. I first asked participants, what was it that drew them to Buddhism? And there were a range of different reasons, largely to do with things such as spirituality, compassion, love, and a desire to improve oneself. I would consider these largely to do with what we refer to as the human condition. It's a very broad phrase that refers to who we are as humans. Only a few people spoke directly about sex, gender, or sexuality. And as you can see here from these two participants, they were attracted to it because of the neutrality they perceived to have Buddhism, that Buddhism has towards gender and sexuality. Others were attracted to Buddhism because of their Christian background. And certainly they emphasized the fact that Catholicism generally, or Christianity generally, rejected them as queer people. So they saw Buddhism as a way of exploring themselves without that implied rejection. Participants were asked to reflect on what they thought was Buddhism's attitude towards queer people. And on average, they rated this as quite neutral, as neither negative or positive. I also asked participants to describe the relationship between being a queer person and being a Buddhist. And on average, they referred to this as a quite positive relationship. A little over half say that they are out within their Buddhist communities. And 41% said that being out is very important to them. For some, however, being out is complicated because of either their identity or their lived experience. So for example, P11 here says that they're still in the process of transitioning, so they're not out in terms of who they are. P23 here says that they're a bisexual person in a heterosexual relationship, and it's very difficult to be out. But they do go on to say that if they're ever assumed to be straight, they always correct that assumption. Over half state that they have felt reluctant to disclose their queer identity within their Buddhist communities. Over half felt that queer issues, queer people were silenced or ignored within their Buddhist communities. Several participants add comments regarding the failure to acknowledge sex, gender and sexuality issues, such as sex-gender segregation in Buddhist retreats. P31 here says they only had 2 separate shared bedrooms, male versus female, which to me was rather limiting. Eleven participants, or 16%, have been told that their queer identity was not in keeping with Buddhist teachings. P6 here says that they were told by some people it's wrong sex conduct. Some stated that they were told this by monastics, by Buddhist texts, Buddhist teachers, family members, and lay members of their Buddhist community. When asked if participants had witnessed discrimination, so I'll just emphasise this is witnessing discrimination, not necessarily having discrimination upon them, but just seeing it in their Buddhist communities. Half had witnessed sexism. 25, that's 36%, had witnessed homophobia, and 18 people, or 26%, had witnessed misgendering or racism. P62 says the judgments and phobias do not disappear because of ordination. They only do because he or she sees the need to change. Okay, so there's some conclusions that we can walk away with from this research so far. So when I compare this cohort of queer Australians to other research that looks at queer Australians, we can say that queer Buddhists are less likely to be born in Australia, more likely to live in New South Wales, they're more likely to be older, they're more likely to have a university education, and they're more likely to have good mental health when compared to queer Australians generally. In other demographics, this sample is quite representative of queer Australians generally. In terms of Buddhism, we can suggest that queer Buddhists do not necessarily have an attraction to Buddhism because of issues related to sex, gender, or sexuality. Like many who come to Buddhism as adults, it's about exploring what I'm referring to here as the human condition, spirituality, love, compassion, getting to be a better person. Some, and I stress this, some do note there is a neutrality towards sex, gender and sexuality, which they like about Buddhism. And others thought that sex, gender and sexuality had nothing to do with their Buddhism. Indeed, some participants were quite antagonistic about this relationship and suggesting that Buddhism has, or sex, gender and sexuality has nothing to do with Buddhism. And they don't know why we're asking these questions. So the 4 main points I want you to walk away with that I mentioned before. More than half of queer Buddhists were reluctant to reveal their queer identities to their Buddhist communities. Half have witnessed some form of sexism, and a third have witnessed some homophobia. 16% have been told that their identity was not in keeping with Buddha's teachings. So what's next? So I'm going to take these early findings and explore them further in in-depth interviews next year. So I want to explore a lot of these issues. I want to explore why isn't sex, gender and sexuality one of the reasons that people are drawn to Buddhism? What is it about sex, gender and sexuality that's not a significant part of Buddhism? What are these experiences of homophobia, sexism, racism? To explore and maybe tease out those stories, those narratives a little bit further. I'm also interested in exploring this idea of the human condition and those aspects of Buddhism that people find attractive. I'm also interested in looking at antagonism. Why are people so antagonistic about this idea of exploring sex, gender, and sexuality within Buddhism? But that's next year. At the moment, I have a report that is ready to go, or should be ready to go after the weekend, that if you are interested in, you can contact me and I can send you an email copy. If you're interested in the research generally, feel free to reach out and contact me. I'm not doing recruitment for the in-depth interviews yet, but if anyone is interested, feel free to let me know and we'll keep your name ready for you. And that's been done. Thank you. I'm going to turn over to Katrina.
All right. We do have a question in the chat. And the question is from Erwin. Is there any queer-friendly Buddhist organisation around Casuarina, Northern Territory area?
Excellent question. So there are quite a few meditation groups, and there are some Buddhist groups also. So have the Chinese temple based in the city and the Buddhist temple at Lianya. I'm not sure how queer-friendly they all are. I think Darwin's such a small community, so it's hard to say. Sorry.
You've got lots of feedback with thank yous and people saying they found the talk very interesting and thank you for sharing your insights. Do have another question from Bante. Oh, I'm going to pronounce people's names wrong. The question is, 50% saw sexism. I'm wondering if that was a response that was gendered. I'm guessing women are more likely than men to see that? Question mark.
I think that's the next step of my analysis, going a little bit further into saying who said what. So this analysis is really just very broad strokes over the top. Now I'm going to go in and have a look a bit more closely about who said what. But I think you're right that there is a tendency for people to see sexism when they may experience it more themselves. But I do have a memory that some of the men did actually notice that as well, yes.
Lovely. We've got someone asking if it's okay to share your paper with their online Buddhist groups.
Absolutely. So if you want to get a copy of the report, I'm happy to make that can be then be made public. I've just got a few more tweaks to make over the next couple of days. But once I've made them, I can send you a copy of the report and that can be shared as well. Absolutely.
So what we'll probably do, Northern Institute has, we're recording this seminar, so that will be edited and put together. Stephen has said that he would kindly share the slides, and that will be put up on our website. So we could also put your paper up as well, Stephen.
Yeah. Yeah.
So all of this information will be shared on our social media and on our website, so keep an eye out for that.
Yeah. One thing I'd like to do with my research isn't just about academia, like getting a book published or going to conferences. It's about making sure that the information I come up with is accessible to the community. So I'm a member of the community and I want that information to be shared.
Brilliant. That's fantastic. Well, I can't see any more questions unless...
Do you have any questions, Katrina?
Actually, we've got one more.
There we go.
An anonymous one. I'm doing research methodology using Buddhist theories and praxis. How important is it to acknowledge as a married woman, in brackets, to a man, that I've a bisexual past?
This is a great question. This is one I'm very committed to, I guess, as a queer person, that I think research should be positioned from subjectivity, so your subject position, where you come from, where your identity is sitting. And I think that acknowledges that it's a point of view. You have a point of view. And certainly if you're an insider or an outsider to a particular group, that's also important for the audience to know. So previously my research on trans people in the Northern Territory, I position myself outside of that discourse of trans. So I identify as non-binary gender queer, but I don't identify as trans. So I think that sort of subjectivity is important to say up front so people know where you're coming from. But I also think it's a personal choice, that there's no, you must do this. It's about how do you feel about exploring that part of yourself and revealing that to the audience, I think. But I think at the very least you should explore that in the setting up of methodology and coming from that point of view. So my background is in feminism and feminist theory and queer theory, and a lot of that feminist theory and queer theory, certainly in terms of research, is about setting up yourself, your subjectivity and where you're coming from in terms of the subject and the topic matter that you're talking about.
Excellent. I do have another question with a comment saying that it's good to have this info available and very useful to help us have these conversations with our Buddhist centres to make sure we're being more inclusive. Do you have any suggestions for how Buddhist centres can be better allies to rainbow Buddhists?
I have many, many suggestions. I think it's about that conversation. I would hope that most Buddhist groups would have an opportunity for people to discuss topics as they arise in the media, in popular culture, whatever it might be. The Buddhist group, the community can talk about that. I know that's not always possible. And I think that would be what I encourage the most, is that the conversations take place. In my research, I asked participants to indicate what Buddhist groups they attend, what Buddhist retreats they've attended, and I de-identified all the results. So anytime I ask questions like that, I remove that question from the data and put it into a separate file, if you like. So I wouldn't be able to say, well, this person went to this Buddhist community, if you like. But what I did notice from that list of people who actually told me what Buddhist groups they go to, it fell into every state and territory had a Buddhist group included. These were capital cities, these were regional areas, these were a range of different Buddhist traditions. So it indicated to me there are queer people in Buddhist groups all over the country. And so all Buddhist centres, all Buddhist groups need to have these conversations because there are queer people in their centres. They probably don't know it. So they should be having these conversations. They should be asking those questions. How can we be allies? and they should be asking them of their own community groups. But it's an ongoing project, as Bhante knows, and we'll be hopefully with the ongoing project into the next phase next year, we'll make it more public and perhaps getting more public recognition and more conversations started, I think. Thanks, Bhante.
Terrific. And we have another question. Do you know of any research about LGBTQIA plus Buddhists in Latin America countries?
The short answer is no, because I have focused mostly on Australia, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I think this is still a relatively new area of research. I think over the last 20 years, there's been a lot of research of queer people within Islam, Christianity, Judaism, but not necessarily Buddhism, in terms of actual research of queer people during actual interviews and things like that. So it's still relatively new. There's some United States studies, but I think in other countries it's relatively new, which I think is interesting in itself. I think it says a lot about where our focus is as a society. We're more interested in some religions and not others. Even though Buddhism has relatively the same number of people. So in Australia, the same number of Buddhists in Australia as there are people who follow Islam.
Okay, and I just wanted to mention that that question was from Ileana, I'm sorry if I've pronounced that wrong, who is zooming in from Mexico.
Yes, thank you.
And another question from Eva, is there any existing group / community / Buddhist spiritual leaders that interprets the Buddhist sutras through an LGBTQIA lens?
The answer is yes. Can I name them? No. So I can get you in contact with them and let you know. But there is a lot of literature about how to see the Buddhist texts from a queer point of view, absolutely. And organisations like Rainbody have a great connection with lots of queer practices across the world. So it's really good. You can tap into that as well as a resource. But always feel free to shoot me an email and I can look into it further. So with Ilana, if you want more information about Mexico or South America, shoot me an email and I'll try and look into some more information for you.
I'm just adding your email address to the chat now.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
I think...
Any questions about my rocket suit? I usually get a few questions.
Do you want to talk to us about it?
So there you go. So this is my rakusu. So in the Zen tradition, it represents the Buddhist robes, the monk robes, and it's a public ceremony. I describe it as a promise. So a jukai ceremony is a promise to follow the precepts. So there are certain precepts that you follow, which aren't the same as like the 10 Commandments in Christianity. And it's a promise like I've made the promise to myself for many years, but I decided I wanted to make the promise publicly in the ceremony. And it's a process of talking with your teacher and talking about the precepts, what they mean to you, and sewing the rakusu. So I sewed this myself from scratch. And it's supposed to represent that the robes, as I said, but sometimes people who make their rakusu, they do it from different points, different pieces of material that may have significance for them. I didn't do that. I felt as though this was a new beginning for me rather than having old pieces of material. And I didn't really have anything, so that had significance to me. So this is all new material.
Okay, we do have, Paul's got a question.
Hi, Paul.
Does mindfulness get muddled with Buddhism?
I think that comes into that question of, well, what is Buddhism? Buddhism is really not a religion for some people. It's really just a philosophy. And a lot of people do lots of things that some might consider to be Buddhist. So meditation, for example. And mindfulness is just a practice that anybody can do. And lots of people get attracted to Buddhism from different religious backgrounds because they're interested in those practices of mindfulness, meditation. And it doesn't really change them being a Christian or Jew or Muslim. So I think there is sometimes that grey area about what belongs where. So mindfulness can be seen as Buddhism, and Buddhism can be seen as mindfulness. They can be both the same and not the same at the same time, this is my non-answer. Thanks, Paul.
Actually, Erwin has just come in and said, I was told by Buddhist monks and nuns that they're happy to convert me from being a bad karma gay person into normal. Would this be the mainstream response from Buddhist organisations usually in Australia?
Well, in terms of normal response, mainstream response, I don't think there is a universal response, but that sort of response is what's your experience is what we are trying to explore a lot more about what are our experiences when we engage with our communities as queer people, and how can we address that together? How can we focus on those issues and perhaps bring about a change of attitude towards that? Certainly looking at more specifically about karma and the idea of karma, that is specific to some traditions of Buddhism. So, for example, in my tradition, we don't really believe in karma in the same way, in reincarnation. So there's lots of variations here of the different traditions of Buddhism about what is karma and reincarnation and those sort of things. The idea of conversion, that's a whole different topic, I guess. One that's been addressed in some governments in Australia by banning conversion. So that's perhaps a bigger question as well. But I wouldn't say there's one mainstream Buddhist response. There are many different ways that people might respond to it. Yeah.
Lovely.
Thank you.
You've got some really nice feedback here about how your talk is most enlightening, really interesting, very valuable. They appreciate your research.
Thank you.
So I think we might close that up now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you,
I wanted to thank you, Stephen, for coming in today and sharing your research with us in this format. I think everyone really appreciated it. And just to let everyone know to keep an eye on Northern Institute's social media and website for when Stephen's presentation will go up, so you can view it and share it. And was there anything else that you wanted to end with, Stephen?
No, thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.